She had never taken a piano lesson in her life. She had grown up in a small town where music was not something people talked about, let alone studied seriously. Her parents loved music, yes, but their tastes were simple, the kind of songs that played softly from the radio while they cooked or cleaned. She had tried pressing the keys on the old piano that sat in the corner of the living room, but it never felt right. The sounds were clumsy, disconnected, and awkward. She would sigh and walk away, telling herself that she simply did not have the talent for it. That was just how life was. Music was for those born with the gift, not for her. But everything changed the day she walked into a small cafe on the edge of town. It was the kind of place people went to when they wanted a quiet cup of coffee or a moment of calm away from the chaos of everyday life. The walls were painted a soft beige, with faded photographs of local scenes hung unevenly around the room. A few tables were scattered near the windows, where sunlight spilled in, casting warm golden squares on the wooden floor. She had come for no other reason than to escape the noise outside, but something inside her told her to stay a little longer that day. The first thing she noticed was the piano. It was tucked into a corner near the back, slightly worn at the edges but polished enough to show care. And sitting at it was a man she had never seen before, tall and lean, with a focused look in his eyes. His hands moved over the keys in a way that seemed natural, effortless, almost magical. She stopped mid-step, caught off guard by the sound that filled the room. It was not loud or showy, but it had depth and soul. Each note seemed to breathe life into the room. People around him were quiet, their conversations fading as they listened. Some leaned forward, others closed their eyes, but all of them were drawn in. She felt something stir inside her, a mix of awe and something she had never allowed herself to feel, hope. She wanted to get closer, to understand how someone could play like that without a single lesson in front of him. But she held back, unsure if she had the right to intrude on this private magic. She lingered near a table at the far end, sipping her coffee, watching as his fingers danced effortlessly over the keys. He played with such emotion that it was almost as if he were speaking without words, telling stories that no one had heard before. There were moments of softness, delicate and fragile, and then bursts of power that made the walls vibrate slightly. She realized that she had never heard a piano played this way. Not in school recitals, not on the radio, not even in the small local concerts that sometimes came to town. This was different, pure, raw. She found herself thinking about all the times she had given up on the piano, all the times she had told herself she wasn't good enough. And now, watching him, she felt a strange combination of envy and inspiration. How could someone be so skilled without lessons, without a teacher guiding them, without someone marking their mistakes and applauding their progress? It seemed impossible, yet here it was, happening right before her eyes. She kept returning to that cafe over the next few days, sometimes for the music, sometimes simply to see him. He was always there at the same time, always playing, always lost in the music. And every time she noticed something new. A subtle movement of his hand, the way his foot tapped gently against the floor, the slight furrow of his brow when he reached a difficult note. There was a story in his playing, she realized, and it made her wonder about the life behind those fingers. Did he always play like this? Had he always been this way? Or was it something he had discovered one day, like a secret he had kept to himself? Curiosity began to take hold. One afternoon, after weeks of watching from a distance, she finally found herself walking toward him. Her heart pounded as she approached. He looked up from the keys and gave a small nod, a gesture that was polite but cautious. She felt her words falter as she tried to explain herself. "You're playing. It's incredible. I've never heard anything like it. Did you take lessons?" He smiled, a quiet, unassuming smile. "No," he said simply. "I never had lessons. I just played. A lot. Every day. That's it." She blinked, uncertain if she had heard him correctly. "Every day? And you just learned on your own?" He shrugged, turning back to the keys as if to show her that words were unnecessary. The sound resumed, flowing gently, effortlessly. She could feel it in her chest, a warmth that was hard to explain. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I just kept playing and I listened a lot. And I never stopped trying, even when it was hard. She sat down in the empty chair nearby, unsure if she should ask more questions or just listen. But the desire to understand, to grasp even a fraction of what he had, was too strong. Over the next hour, she asked questions about how he remembered notes, how he practiced, and how he developed his own style. Each answer was simple, but it made her realize something important. Talent was not just about natural ability. It was about persistence, about curiosity, about the willingness to spend hours exploring something that others might give up on. That day, she walked home feeling a strange mix of emotions. She was inspired but also frustrated with herself. Why had she given up so easily? Why had she believed that she didn't have the gift? She thought about her childhood, about the piano in her living room, about all the half-hearted attempts she had made. She realized that she had been afraid of failure, afraid of looking foolish, afraid of trying and not being good enough. And yet here was someone who had embraced every mistake as part of the journey. Someone who had turned curiosity into art. She began to think differently about music, about learning, about herself. If he could achieve such skill without lessons, then maybe she could find her own way too. Not by copying him, not by forcing herself to become exactly like him, but by exploring her own path, her own emotions, her own voice. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had no roadmap, no guide, no teacher to tell her what to do. But maybe that was the point. Maybe true music came from exploring the unknown, from trusting her instincts, from letting herself be vulnerable. Over the next few days, she returned to the piano at home. At first, her fingers stumbled and clumsily found notes, just as they always had. But she remembered his words, his calm confidence, and she allowed herself to play without judgment. She experimented with melodies, letting her emotions guide her hands rather than trying to play perfectly. Some days were frustrating. Some days brought fleeting moments of beauty, but she kept at it, quietly, determinedly. The man at the cafe continued to be a source of quiet inspiration. She didn't ask him for formal lessons, and he never offered. Instead, she watched, listened, and absorbed. And in those moments, she began to understand something profound. Talent could be sparked in anyone, even without formal instruction, if they were willing to engage with it fully, honestly, and passionately. It wasn't about perfection. It was about connection, emotion, and persistence. And so her journey began, not with a teacher, not with lessons, but with curiosity and courage. She did not yet know where it would lead, or how far she could go. All she knew was that music had found her in a way that changed everything. It was no longer just background noise. It was a part of her, something she wanted to explore, nurture, and understand. The first part of her story, the part where discovery had awakened something she never knew existed, was just beginning. She had stepped into a world of sound, feeling, and expression that promised to challenge her, to surprise her, and to transform her in ways she could not yet imagine. And she knew, deep down, that she would never be the same again. She continued to visit the piano at home every day. At first, her attempts were awkward. Her fingers did not bend the way she wanted. Her hands did not find the right notes, and she often gave up, frustrated by her own clumsiness. But something inside her had changed. Watching the man at the cafe had planted a seed of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her own way to play even without lessons. Every day she sat at the piano, she experimented with sounds, letting her emotions guide her fingers rather than trying to play perfectly. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined the music as a story, each note representing a feeling, a memory, or a small moment in her life. Slowly, she noticed small improvements. A chord she had struggled with yesterday now felt easier. A melody she had only imagined could be played without too many mistakes. It was subtle progress, but it gave her hope. Despite her private practice, she often thought of the man at the cafe. His talent seemed almost impossible, yet he had no formal training. How did he manage to make the piano sing so effortlessly? She wanted to ask him more questions to understand his mindset, his process, the way he learned. But every time she considered approaching him again, a wave of doubt stopped her. What if he thought she was annoying? What if he refused to talk to her? She reminded herself that she was only a beginner, a mere shadow of what he had accomplished. One afternoon, she found herself back at the cafe, unable to resist the pull of the music. He was there, as usual, and began playing the moment she stepped inside. She watched as he moved with confidence, the notes flowing seamlessly. People around him were quiet, lost in the music. She felt the familiar mix of admiration and envy, but also a spark of inspiration. She wanted to understand him, to capture even a fragment of his skill. Summoning courage, she approached him cautiously. This time, she did not ask about lessons. Instead, she asked about his practice. How do you decide what to play? How do you improve? She asked softly. He paused for a moment, then smiled. I just follow what I feel. If something sounds wrong, I play it again until it feels right. I listen a lot, not just to music, but to everything around me. Sounds, voices, movements, they all teach me something. And I never stop trying. Even mistakes are part of learning. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. It sounded simple, almost too simple, but she realized it was not just technique. It was about patience, observation, and persistence. She thought about her own practice at home. She had been so focused on getting it right that she had forgotten to listen, to feel, to connect with the music in her own way. The next day, she returned to the piano with renewed focus. She let herself make mistakes, letting the notes tumble out without judgment. She played slowly, listening to each sound, adjusting, correcting, and trying again. She discovered that the piano could express feelings she had never put into words. She could be frustrated, happy, sad, or even angry, and each note reflected her emotions in a way that speaking never could. It was exhausting at times, but also exhilarating. As days passed, she noticed more subtle changes. Her hands moved more confidently, her timing improved, and her ear for melody became sharper. She began to experiment with short compositions, creating small pieces that felt personal and unique. She no longer measured herself against others. Her goal was simply to play, to connect with the piano, to explore her own expression. Meanwhile, her visits to the cafe became less about watching him and more about sharing space with someone who understood the piano intimately. She no longer felt intimidated by his talent. Instead, she felt motivated, inspired to explore what was possible for her. They sometimes exchanged small tips. He would demonstrate a simple trick for holding a chord. She would ask questions about rhythm or expression. Their conversations were brief but meaningful, centered around curiosity and learning. One afternoon, she took a bold step. She asked if she could try playing in the cafe while he listened. Her hands shook as she approached the piano. The man gave her an encouraging nod, and she began to play a small melody she had practiced at home. At first, the notes were shaky, uneven, and uncertain. But as she continued, something changed. She relaxed. Her fingers found their own path, and the melody started to flow. It was not perfect, but it was hers, and that made it beautiful. When she finished, the man smiled. That was good. You can feel the music, he said simply. She felt a rush of pride and relief. No one had ever acknowledged her playing before, and hearing that someone so talented could appreciate it gave her a confidence she had never felt. Over the next weeks, she continued both her home practice and her visits to the cafe. She faced days of frustration, moments where her fingers refused to obey, and times when she thought she would never improve. But she also had days of small triumphs. A chord that finally felt right, a melody she had imagined coming to life, a rhythm that flowed naturally. Each of these moments reinforced her determination. She began to notice changes outside the piano as well. Her patience grew, her focus sharpened, and her confidence in trying new things increased. The lessons she had learned from music, persistence, attention, creativity, and self-expression were spreading into her everyday life. She realized that the piano was not just an instrument. It was a teacher, guiding her through challenges and helping her discover her own strengths. The man at the cafe continued to inspire her quietly. He never gave her formal lessons, and he never pressured her to improve. He simply played, showing by example that dedication, curiosity, and passion could lead to incredible results. She realized that his approach, though unstructured, contained lessons she could take into her own practice. Listen carefully, play often, and never fear mistakes. By the end of this part of her journey, she was no longer the same person who had walked into the cafe weeks ago. She had faced her doubts, embraced her curiosity, and taken the first real steps toward developing her own musical voice. She knew she still had a long way to go, and the path ahead would not be easy. But she also knew that progress was possible, that learning could be joyful, and that raw talent, when combined with persistence and curiosity, could spark something extraordinary. She left the cafe one evening, her heart light with excitement. The sunlight fell across the sidewalk, casting warm patterns as she walked home, and she felt a quiet thrill at the thought of returning to the piano. The journey was just beginning, but she had already discovered the joy of exploring music for herself. Every note she played, every melody she imagined, was a small victory, a step toward something greater. And for the first time, she truly believed that she could achieve more than she had ever dreamed. Her confidence had begun to grow, but she knew she still had a long way to go. The piano at home had become a companion, a place where she could experiment, fail, and discover little victories that made her heart race with joy. Every day, she challenged herself to play longer, to try new melodies, and to push her fingers in ways they had never moved before. Each day was a mix of frustration and triumph, and she had come to cherish both. The man at the cafe remained a quiet but powerful presence in her life. She no longer watched him with the same awe-filled hesitation she had at first. Now, she observed him with a sense of understanding and curiosity, eager to learn, to notice patterns, and to absorb lessons without words. He never gave instructions or asked her to mimic him, but she realized that the way he played taught her something far deeper than simple technique. It was about passion, about listening, about feeling each note before striking it. She began to see that music was as much about emotion as it was about skill. One afternoon, she worked up the courage to ask him a question that had been lingering in her mind for weeks. "How do you come up with the melodies?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Do you plan them, or do they just come to you?" He looked at her thoughtfully, tapping a finger against the keys without pressing them. "Sometimes they come from nothing," he said softly. "Sometimes I hear a sound, a rhythm, a word in my head, and it grows into something bigger. And sometimes I start with a feeling, an emotion, and I let the music find its own way. The important part is to listen and to follow it, even if it doesn't make sense at first." She nodded, letting his words sink in. There was a freedom in his approach that she had never experienced before. She realized that she had been so focused on perfection and rules that she had forgotten about exploration and self-expression. For the first time, she understood that her own feelings, her own stories, could guide the music, and that was a kind of magic she had never considered. Back at home, she began to experiment with this new approach. She would sit at the piano and let her emotions dictate her fingers, sometimes playing slowly and delicately, other times striking notes with sudden intensity. Each session became a journey, an adventure in sound and feeling. Mistakes no longer frustrated her. They were discoveries, signs that she was pushing herself beyond comfort. She found herself smiling during practice, something she had rarely done before. Her daily routine began to change. She woke up thinking about music, planning small ideas in her mind, and returning home eager to play. She started carrying a small notebook with her, jotting down ideas, rhythms, and melodies she imagined during the day. Even when she was not at the piano, her mind was alive with sound, searching for ways to bring what she heard and felt into the music she played. Music had become a constant presence, a companion and teacher. As her skill improved, she began experimenting with combining notes in ways that felt personal, creating short pieces that reflected her mood and experiences. Some were joyful, some melancholic, some playful, and others contemplative. Each piece was imperfect, yet it carried a piece of herself within it. The process of creating her own music filled her with a sense of pride and accomplishment that she had never known. She began to see her mistakes not as failures, but as stepping stones that guided her toward new discoveries. Meanwhile, her connection with the man at the cafe continued to deepen, though unspoken. They shared moments of music and silence, both aware of the other's presence and growth. Sometimes he would play a simple melody, and she would try to capture its essence in her own way. Other times, she would improvise and play a piece she had composed, feeling his subtle nod or gentle smile as a quiet acknowledgement. Their relationship was one of silent mentorship, a shared understanding that went beyond words. One day, she brought a new piece she had been working on to the cafe, feeling both excitement and nervousness. As she began to play, her fingers stumbled at first, but she quickly found a rhythm, letting her emotions guide her. The notes were raw and uneven at times, but there was a beauty in their honesty. The man listened quietly, his eyes closed, seemingly lost in the sound. When she finished, he simply nodded. "You're finding your voice," he said. Those words struck her deeply, more than any praise she had received before. It was not about perfection or comparison. It was about discovery, about finding the music that was uniquely hers. Encouraged by this acknowledgement, she started to challenge herself more. She began exploring more complex melodies, trying to incorporate dynamics, rhythm changes, and subtle variations. She listened to recordings of different styles of music, absorbing what resonated with her and experimenting with it at the piano. She discovered that she enjoyed blending different influences, letting her own interpretation shape the sound. Her fingers moved with more confidence, her ear for melody sharpened, and her sense of timing improved. During this period, she also began to notice how music affected her emotions and thoughts. Playing became a form of release, a way to process frustration, happiness, sadness, and hope. She would play late into the evening, sometimes until her fingers ached, lost in the ebb and flow of sound. Each session brought a sense of calm and satisfaction, a feeling that she was connecting with something deeper than herself. The cafe became a place of experimentation and reflection. She would sit and play, sometimes alongside him, sometimes alone. Each day brought new discoveries, a chord that sounded richer than before, a melody that surprised her, a rhythm that felt intuitive. She began to trust her instincts, allowing her own creativity to guide her rather than relying solely on observation. Music was no longer just an interest, it was a part of her identity. Her friends and family started noticing subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed more confident, focused, and expressive. Conversations with her became richer, and her presence carried a quiet energy that drew people in. Though she rarely spoke about her piano journey, they could sense that something important was happening in her life. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was a source of growth, inspiration, and personal transformation. Despite her progress, she was aware that there were still challenges ahead. Some pieces remained difficult, and certain techniques eluded her. But she had learned to embrace struggle as part of the process. Every mistake, every failed attempt, was a lesson, a step closer to improvement. She realized that mastery was not about perfection, but about persistence, exploration, and willingness to grow. As weeks turned into months, she noticed how far she had come. The clumsy, hesitant player she once was had evolved into someone capable of creating melodies that felt meaningful and expressive. Her fingers moved more freely, her timing improved, and her understanding of harmony deepened. Each session at the piano reinforced her love for music and strengthened her confidence in her own abilities. The man at the cafe continued to play his part, quietly inspiring her through presence rather than instruction. She understood now that the lessons he offered were not in direct guidance, but in example. Dedication, passion, listening, and the courage to explore. Watching him, she had learned patience and perseverance, realizing that growth was a gradual process, nurtured by curiosity and practice. By the end of this part of her journey, she was no longer the hesitant, uncertain person who had first approached the cafe. She had discovered a growing confidence in her abilities, a deeper connection to music, and a newfound appreciation for exploration and creativity. She had begun to see the piano not as a challenge to conquer, but as a friend, a guide, and a medium through which she could express herself fully. She left the cafe one evening, her heart light with the satisfaction of progress. The world outside seemed different, brighter, as if every sound, every movement, and every moment held a note of possibility. She was still learning, still growing, but she knew that the journey itself was as important as the destination. Music had become a part of her, shaping her thoughts, emotions, and character. And as she walked home, she felt a quiet anticipation for the next session at the piano, eager to explore further, to create, and to continue discovering the depth of her own voice. She had come a long way from the hesitant beginner who first sat at a piano. Each day, she felt more confident, more capable, and more connected to the music. Her fingers moved with greater ease, her ear for melody had sharpened, and she began experimenting with longer, more complex pieces. Music was no longer just a pastime. It had become a part of her identity, a lens through which she could understand herself and the world. One afternoon, while she was practicing at the cafe, she noticed a small crowd gathering. It was unusual. Normally, only a few regulars lingered to listen. The man at the piano was playing with his usual skill, drawing the audience silently into the music. She watched him for a moment, captivated, and then felt a sudden urge to share her own progress. She had been practicing a piece she had composed herself, something simple but heartfelt, and she wanted to test her ability in front of others. Her hands trembled as she approached the piano, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The cafe had grown quiet, people noticing her presence. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was not about perfection, but about expression. She began to play her piece. At first, the notes were tentative, uneven, and uncertain. But gradually, she found her rhythm, her fingers moving more confidently, guided by the emotions she wanted to convey. As she played, she noticed the reactions of those around her. People were leaning forward, listening intently, some with soft smiles, others with eyes closed, fully absorbed. She felt a strange warmth, a connection she had never experienced before. Her music was reaching others, touching them in ways she had not imagined. The fear that had once held her back was replaced by a sense of joy and fulfillment. Each note, each pause, each rise and fall of melody became a conversation between her and the listeners. When she finished, the room remained silent for a moment before erupting into gentle applause. She felt her cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and pride. The man at the piano gave her a small, encouraging nod, a gesture that meant more than words could express. In that moment, she realized that she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just learning. She was performing, sharing her voice, and connecting with others through music. Encouraged by this experience, she began to perform more often, both at the cafe and in other small venues. Each performance brought new lessons. The importance of timing, the power of emotion, the need to trust herself even when the music did not go as planned. She learned to embrace the unpredictability of live playing, understanding that mistakes were not failures but opportunities to adapt and grow. The experience of performing added a new dimension to her practice, deepening her understanding of music and her own abilities. As she performed, she also began to reflect on her journey. She thought about the days when she had struggled to produce a single note, the moments of frustration and self-doubt, and the quiet perseverance that had carried her through. She realized that her growth was not just about skill. It was about courage, patience, and persistence. Music had taught her to face challenges, to embrace mistakes, and to trust in the process of learning. The man at the cafe continued to inspire her, though he remained a quiet presence. She no longer compared herself to him. Instead, she saw him as a source of guidance, an example of dedication and passion. He never judged her or corrected her. He simply played, showing by example the beauty of commitment and the power of music to communicate emotion. Through him, she had learned that talent was not merely a gift, but a combination of curiosity, persistence, and the courage to explore. Her confidence began to extend beyond the piano. She approached challenges in her daily life with a new mindset, willing to try, willing to fail, and willing to learn. She discovered that the lessons she had learned through music, focus, patience, creativity, and self-expression were applicable to other areas of her life. She felt more capable, more resilient, and more connected to her own potential. During this period, she also began to experiment with collaborative music. She would play alongside other musicians, improvising and responding to their sounds. These experiences taught her about listening, adapting, and communicating through music. She discovered the joy of creating something together, of blending her voice with others, and of finding harmony in collaboration. Each session expanded her understanding of music and enriched her journey. Her family and friends noticed the change in her. They saw someone who had grown more confident, expressive, and engaged with the world. She no longer shied away from challenges or dismissed her own potential. Music had transformed her, giving her a voice and a sense of purpose. She began to share her experiences with others, encouraging friends and acquaintances to explore their own creative paths, to listen, to play, and to express themselves. One evening, after a long day of practice and performance, she sat quietly at the piano, reflecting on how far she had come. She remembered the hesitant beginner who had first walked into the cafe, unsure of her abilities and afraid of failure. She thought about the countless hours of practice, the moments of frustration, and the small victories that had led to this point. She felt gratitude for the journey, for the music, and for the presence of someone who had inspired her without instruction. In that quiet moment, she realized that music had become more than just a skill. It was a way of life. It had taught her resilience, patience, creativity, and courage. It had connected her to others, to her own emotions, and to a deeper understanding of herself. She understood that the journey was ongoing, that there were always new challenges, new pieces to explore, and new ways to grow. Her performances continued to evolve. She began experimenting with more complex compositions, incorporating her own ideas and interpretations. She discovered that each performance was an opportunity to communicate, to express emotion, and to connect with an audience. The feedback she received, both verbal and nonverbal, reinforced her growth and encouraged her to continue exploring her potential. As the months passed, she became increasingly aware of the impact of music on her life. It had transformed her confidence, her creativity, and her ability to connect with others. She realized that the lessons she had learned were not limited to the piano. They applied to all aspects of life. Music had taught her to persevere, to embrace challenges, and to trust in her own voice. The man at the cafe continued to play alongside her, offering silent support and inspiration. Their relationship remained one of mutual respect and understanding, rooted in a shared love of music. Through his example, she had learned the value of dedication, passion, and authenticity. She understood that true talent was not just about ability, but about the willingness to explore, create, and grow. By the end of this stage in her journey, she had transformed from a hesitant beginner into a confident performer, capable of expressing herself through music and connecting with others. She had learned to embrace mistakes, to trust her instincts, and to find joy in the process of creation. Music had become a central part of her identity, shaping her thoughts, emotions, and experiences. As she left the cafe one evening, she felt a sense of accomplishment and anticipation. The journey was far from over, but she had discovered the power of persistence, the beauty of self-expression, and the joy of connecting with others through music. Each note she played, each melody she composed, and each performance she shared was a step forward, a testament to her growth and dedication. She knew that the path ahead would continue to challenge her, inspire her, and transform her, and she was ready to embrace it fully. She had come a long way from the girl who had once feared touching the piano keys. Her practice had become more confident, her compositions more expressive, and her performances had grown more assured. She no longer worried about perfection. She focused on the connection she could create through music, the emotions she could share, and the stories she could tell without words. The man at the cafe continued to be a quiet presence in her musical journey. He never gave her instructions or corrected her mistakes. Instead, he played alongside her, offered encouragement through small nods or smiles, and allowed her to find her own way. His example had shown her that music was not just about ability but about passion, persistence, and listening. Through him, she had learned that raw talent could inspire, but growth and dedication were what transformed that talent into art. Her performances had begun to attract attention beyond the cafe. Friends and acquaintances encouraged her to play at small events, local gatherings, and community spaces. Each new opportunity was both exciting and intimidating. She would feel the same nervous energy she had felt during her first performance, but she had learned to embrace it as part of the experience. The audience no longer intimidated her. They became partners in the conversation she created with each note. One evening, she was invited to play at a local cultural gathering. The room was larger than the cafe, filled with people she did not know. Her heart raced as she approached the piano, but she took a deep breath and remembered everything she had learned. She started playing a piece she had composed herself, letting her emotions guide her fingers. The notes flowed naturally, carrying both her nervousness and her excitement, blending them into something alive and real. As she played, she noticed the audience leaning forward, listening intently. Some closed their eyes, swaying slightly, absorbed in the music. She felt a deep sense of connection, a realization that music had the power to reach beyond words, to touch hearts, and to create shared experiences. The applause at the end of her performance was louder and more enthusiastic than anything she had experienced before, but it was not the applause that mattered. It was the feeling that she had communicated something true, something personal, and that it had been received with openness. Her journey had not been easy. There had been days of frustration, moments when her fingers would not cooperate, and times when self-doubt crept in. But each struggle had taught her something important. Mistakes were lessons, persistence was a virtue, and every small step forward mattered. She had learned that growth was a process, not a destination, and that the joy of discovery lay in the journey itself. The man at the cafe had also grown in his own way. Though his talent was still extraordinary, he had found satisfaction in seeing her progress, in witnessing the spark of creativity and confidence in someone who had once been uncertain. Their shared experiences had created a silent bond, built on respect, understanding, and a mutual love for music. He had taught her more than technique. He had shown her the value of patience, the importance of listening, and the courage to explore without fear. As her confidence grew, she began composing longer pieces, combining melodies, rhythms, and harmonies in ways that reflected her experiences and emotions. She experimented with dynamics, tempo, and phrasing, discovering the nuances that gave her music depth and personality. Each composition became a story, a reflection of her inner world, and a way to connect with listeners on a deeper level. She also began collaborating with other musicians, exploring improvisation, and learning to adapt her playing to different styles and contexts. These collaborations taught her flexibility, creativity, and the joy of creating something larger than herself. Each session was a lesson in communication, intuition, and expression, reinforcing everything she had learned from her own practice and from observing the man at the cafe. Outside of music, she noticed changes in her confidence and outlook. She approached challenges with a sense of curiosity and resilience, applying the lessons she had learned at the piano to other areas of her life. She was more patient, more attentive, and more willing to take risks. Music had taught her to trust herself, to embrace mistakes, and to value persistence and effort over perfection. As she reflected on her journey, she realized how far she had come. From a girl who doubted her abilities and feared failure, she had grown into a confident musician capable of expressing herself and connecting with others through her art. Her passion for music had become a central part of her identity, shaping her thoughts, emotions, and experiences. One quiet evening, she sat at the piano at home, playing a piece she had composed that captured the essence of her journey. Each note carried memories, struggles, and triumphs, blending them into a story that was uniquely hers. She felt gratitude for the journey, for the music, and for the presence of someone who had inspired her without instruction, allowing her to find her own path. She understood now that music was not just about skill or talent. It was about exploration, expression, and connection. It was about listening, feeling, and allowing oneself to grow. She had discovered the beauty of imperfection, the value of persistence, and the joy of sharing something personal with others. Music had become a lens through which she could understand herself and the world. Her journey was far from over. There were still pieces to learn, compositions to create, and performances to explore. But she was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had learned to embrace challenges, to trust her instincts, and to find joy in the process of discovery. Each new day brought opportunities to grow, to experiment, and to connect through music. The man at the cafe remained a quiet, inspiring presence, a reminder of the power of dedication and passion. Though their interactions were simple and unspoken at times, he had left an indelible mark on her journey. Through his example, she had learned that raw talent was only the beginning. It was curiosity, persistence, and the willingness to explore that transformed potential into artistry. As she continued to play, compose, and perform, she carried with her the lessons of the past. The importance of patience, the value of listening, the courage to make mistakes, and the joy of creation. Music had become more than a skill or a hobby. It was a way of life, a source of inspiration, and a path to self-discovery. In the end, she realized that her journey was not defined by the number of lessons she had taken or the skill she had acquired, but by the growth, connection, and fulfillment she had found along the way. She had discovered her voice, her passion, and her capacity for creativity. And as she sat at the piano, letting her fingers bring her thoughts and emotions to life, she knew that music would continue to guide, challenge, and inspire her for years to come. The story that had begun with hesitation, doubt, and curiosity had evolved into one of confidence, expression, and connection. She had learned that the true measure of talent was not just natural ability, but the willingness to explore, persist, and embrace the journey. And with that understanding, she looked forward to the future, eager to continue discovering the endless possibilities that music had to offer.